So, good afternoon and welcome to the 175th CPR CSH workshop. This afternoon, we are going to be speaking about governing the urban commons, placemaking projects as pathways to the future. And many of you will, of course, know our speaker, who is been a central figure in discussions on urbanization in India. Dr. Anant Parinkanti is currently the executive director of Hyderabad Urban Labs, an organization he founded about 12 years ago and is based in Hyderabad. His research and teaching interests, as many of you are aware from a lot of his work, focuses on issues of urbanization and globalization from the global south, specifically the South Asian vantage point. And I don't need to tell you his publications, which are numerous, but Anant has always been interested in engaging with the practice and how all those ideas actually work out in the field. And today, we'll be talking precisely about one of those instances, a project which sort of was broadly conceptualized just before COVID and then came to fruition over time as these structures came into place. So, Anant, the screen is yours, and you have about somewhere between 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the room to questions. And the tradition in the CPR-CHS workshop is that we continue as long as questions continue. But we will make, except I see the number of attendees and I can see that that might go on for a very long time, but we will sort of make arrangements if it comes to that. Rituparna, you had, is there an issue with the audio or video or anything of that sort? I see that you have a hand raised. Do you want to just, yeah, go ahead. I guess not. So, Anant,
yeah.
Please go ahead.
Thanks, Partha. Thanks, everyone. I want to actually start this conversation, and I'm calling it a conversation because I spoke with Partha a couple of hours ago, and I asked him why is this being called a workshop, and he said that the original idea of this was to take unfinished work, take bits and pieces, try and see where we can take these ideas. There are multiple pathways where the kinds of ideas that we're talking about can go. And each of them is very exciting for me. So that's exactly how I'm going to set this up. I'm going to open up a number of possible ways of thinking about our own practice at Hyderabad Urban Lab, but also work that kind of intersects with what a lot of people in India are doing at this point of time. But before I start off on that, I also want to recall, which I realized this morning again, when I was trying to think about where my interest in urban land began. One of the starting points for this was actually a conversation in CPR that happened about 12 years ago. And Partha was actually part of instrumental in that. He invited me to CPR as I was just about beginning to settle down back in India. And I met with K.C. Sivaram Krishnan, and one of the things that we ended up talking about was urban land. And he said that he was always opposed to the idea of giving away land to people, even the poor, for the simple reason that for the state in a country like India, land is family silver. And they said that you don't give away family silver, you hold on to it because that's all you have. And countries like ours actually have only that. And that I thought was a very interesting, astute in some ways, maybe politically not very correct in some contexts, but an interesting way of thinking about land. And over the years, I and many of my colleagues at Hyderabad Urban Lab have found that a number of government officials actually do think of land as family silver, that you hold on to it for the state. And it's particularly the revenue department which produces the most amount of knowledge. The revenue department is the arbitrator of knowledge on land. The revenue department is the custodian of all of that knowledge. And, and they do think of land as family silver. It belongs to the state. It's meant to be used for the public. And I've always thought about what does this mean in cities, because in the city, the nature of land has completely changed from what it used to be, particularly when the new urbanizable land all around the city kind of slowly gets engulfed by urban processes. So as I kept thinking about that, I thought that that's really where my concern about this question of commons comes from. I work with the idea of commons in a much broader sense, in ideological sense, in the sense of the commons being digital commons, the commons being intellectual property of various kinds, the commons being not necessarily material. But in the end, in this particular presentation, I'm going to be talking about commons as simply a question of land. Yeah, and that's the because that's what this particular thread in my work has actually been trying to deal with. So I'm going to quickly run through a set of images so that we can get some handle on what I'm trying to think about, and I can lay out the various threads in my thinking, and then we can come back to the conversation. So I called this governing urban commons and placemaking projects as pathways to the future. What do I mean by governing urban commons? As I said, I mean by commons, I'm talking about land. And in a moment, I'll show you what I mean by land as commons. The revenue department, as I'm saying, is the key custodian and arbitrator of all knowledge about these commons. And over a period of time, the revenue department has actually lost its ability to be a fair arbitrator of this knowledge. This is something that I've found in a lot of my work on commons, not just in the urban, but also in rural areas. And then the third thing is that the idea of commons is very closely connected to the idea of community. And one of the things that we have discovered again and again and again is that the community is not a pre-existing corporate entity with very clear boundaries. If we enter any space with that kind of an idea, we are actually going to run into a lot of disappointments. Community can only be actually imagined as an outcome of practices of commoning. That's the way in which we can actually start creating new possibilities in our urban. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. So this is an image of Hyderabad city. If any of you are familiar with the city, you will know that every square mile of the city has at least one water body. And in fact, that's exactly how Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya very famously described the city in 1909 after the devastating flood of the September 28th of 1908. He said that in a roughly in an area of 748 square miles, there are 800 water bodies. And these water bodies are arranged on contours, connected both horizontally and down the contour lines vertically. Now, what happens is that every now and then you have excess precipitation happening in a very short time. And then the tanks at the top level breach, and then you have a cascading effect, everything breaches, and then finally you have the city completely inundated at some point or the other. So given this kind of a situation, over a period of time, between let's say 1200 AD and 1900 AD, over a period of literally 700-800 years, gradually a number of villages developed systems of managing their land as productive assets, as lands that are useful for various kinds of ecological services, as lands that are meant to be left fallow. They're not meant to be actually owned by anyone. And that's where the idea of land as commons to me comes from. And I'm saying, in some ways, when I'm saying that this is what has happened in Hyderabad, I'm saying that this is what has happened in most of the cities. All revenue departments, which are about extracting tax revenue from land, look for property that can be very productive, that can release, that can actually yield tax revenues for the state. And they do actually then leave out a number of pieces of land in some kind of a tapestry that actually do not yield taxes. That is land that nobody owns. The government doesn't own it. It's community owned. There are custodianships. There are community practices. There are methods of managing them. And all of those kinds of practices essentially disappear when land gets urbanized, because the private land, which is the productive land, which is held by individuals or even by the government in some cases, that gets turned into property. And what essentially happens when agrarian landscapes turn into urban landscapes is that land which has been until then understood as something which has a productive value, something that has use values, turns into a flat surface that has to be designed for efficient delivery of services, resources, etc. Right? That's when you have a strange situation where the ecological commons, the low value, the suboptimal values of lands actually do not get factored into this, and governments don't know what to do with them. Especially in the last 40, 50, 60 years, the older knowledge is about lands and what you should do with them to respect the elements. When it rains, where does the water flow? How do you manage that drainage patterns, etc.? They've all been completely forgotten. To some extent, the revenue department is guilty here. To some extent, planners have been very, very seriously guilty of all of this. But whoever is responsible for it, it really doesn't matter anymore. But whether you call it Porambok land, Banjar land, Gairan land, or you call it Gutta Porambokku, Vagu Porambokku, littoral zones of water bodies, there are all kinds of revenue categories which actually are meant to be stewarded, meant to be held in custodianship by people, and people do extract value from that, but nothing very, very heavy duty. Those are the lands that actually over a period of time have become places where people have built houses, um, and most of them are actually slums simply because they don't get access to the main property markets of the city. They're too expensive. They can't enter it. So they settle down on these kinds of lands, which are the original agrarian commons. This is an area in Hyderabad. Very quickly, you can see the edge of Hyderabad city, where you will see that there is a rocky patch, there is a green agricultural fields, and then you have some kind of a settlement, which very gradually over a period of time is turned into apartment complexes. The rocky patch is lost. The water bodies are completely now shrunken, and the links between those, which is the blue lines that you see, are completely covered by cement and concrete. And this is where the commons has completely disappeared. This is another place, which is a 400-acre piece of land, very, very prestigious land in the center of the city, in Banjara Hills. And there are 23 small water bodies inside this, and they all kind of empty into this very large water body called Chiran Kunta, which then empties into a number of water bodies down the hill slopes along 4 separate ridges. And each of these has then a number of common areas around it, which are not meant to be turned into properties, but they've all now practically turned into slums. This is another lake in Hyderabad where you'll see it's called Hamid Khan Kunta, a very tragic case of a water body that is no longer actually functioning as a water body. The 1.5 kilometer stretch canal that connects the bigger tank to the lower tank is now completely buried under an RCC slab. And the Singada tank in the middle of it has now completely turned into a slum, right? This is another tank where you will see that the pink area is a huge slum. There are about 18 slums inside of that. This is bang in the middle of the most expensive property in the city. So in this kind of a situation where land is actually spread out across the city in all kinds of complicated ways, where it is not easy to actually pin down who owns what should be done with it, what are the different kinds of claims, that placemaking projects are actually operating right now. And I found over a period of time that something really, really interesting is going on in the name of placemaking projects. First of all, the big context for placemaking projects in our cities is that the cities in the global south is actually an extremely incalculable space. You don't know in many cases the boundaries of the property. You don't know who owns what. There are all kinds of local practices that establish claims on pieces of land. And those are established over a period of time. They are owned, they are policed by communities, by caste groups, by local powerful folks. All kinds of things are happening. In that kind of a situation, you also have this additional problem that has come up in the last 20, 30, 40 years, which is that local governments have actually no longer have the capacity to spend money in small quantums. Most local governments would be quite comfortable spending large amounts of money. But when it comes to small amounts of money, they really, really don't know how to actually execute it, or they don't know how to procure things. And this is something that we are finding across the board in many, many places. So in this kind of a situation where you don't have control over place, where you don't have the capacity to make quick investments and so on, we're basically seeing two types of outcomes for placemaking projects. One is what is broadly understood as tactical urbanist projects, which are projects that are like flash projects. You do something very quickly, create a kind of a window, make something visible, and then you pack up from there. The other direction in which placemaking projects have gone is the direction of scaling up beautification projects, where you imagine that you can do 50 of those projects at one go through one single corporation. And this happens often because of financing ease. So instead of saying that I want to spend 10 lakh rupees on each project, you're going to say that I'm going to do 50 projects, and 50 into 10, 500 lakhs, that's 5 crores is how I'm going to actually do the contracting. Are there alternative imaginations in a situation like this? Now, this is where I wanted to show you something that we did. Partha was saying that this started about just before COVID. This is an image of one of our first projects. It's a slum in which you have houses on either side. When we started work here, this was full of rocks, very slippery, very precarious. And in about 4 months' time, this was transformed into a small staircase, which is now become a public space in the slum. It's about total cost of about 2.5 lakhs. And I'll shut off this part of the presentation for now and show you something else for a moment. So when we did this work, the initial trigger for this came from Wipro Foundation, which basically requested us to see if we could make some kind of an intervention in the space of water in the city. And in partnership with Wipro Foundation, we put together a roundtable in which one of the things that we were very curious at that point of time was that we seem to have a lot of domain expertise in different silos. So you have experts on piped water supply, you have experts on groundwater, you have experts on surface water, you have experts on river water, but we don't seem to have actually any way of uh, connecting all of these different kinds of water, because in the end, we're bringing water from about 150 kilometers away into the city and taking it into our apartments, mixing it up with groundwater from within the city, turning it into gray water and black water, and then throwing it back into the water bodies that are normally supposed to hold only rainwater. And in essence, what we are doing is that we are ending up with a highly contaminated water bodies network in the city, and we just don't know where to go with this. Given that situation, we ran a small roundtable workshop. Um, Pata, can you hear me? Is my voice audible?
Yes, it's audible, Anand. Hi.
Can someone indicate me whether I'm audible?
It's audible, Anand.
So what we did then was to run this workshop in which, yeah, what we did is to run this workshop in which we basically requested people to tell us what they did not know rather than what they knew. And the conversation was very exciting, where lots of interesting cross connections emerged in the process. And at the end of it, the one idea that we came up with is that maybe the way to move forward is to start undertaking small intervention projects in the city, something to do with water. We don't know exactly what that would be, but let us see if we can actually put some way of acting and use that intervention to begin to understand the nature of water in the city, particularly in the urban context. So as we started putting that together, we ran a competition. And in the competition, we received a number of entries. One of them essentially proposed this slum as a place of the intervention. The idea was that they will try and build a small staircase to to straighten out all of the messy, mangled network of water pipelines that came down the hill slope from the top, create a pathway for rainwater that is coming from all around, and do all of this with the involvement of the people who were essentially saying that, look, we're scared to walk up and down this, that kids who are falling down and they're injured. And so we want something to fix this. So that's how this project actually happened. So at that point of time, we were not thinking about this as placemaking project or as even anything particularly creative with water. We were just basically thinking that let's do something to see where we can go with these ideas. Now I'm going to show you where all of this kind of experimentation finally led us. Yeah. So that project which I just showed you happened in 2020, just as the lockdown began, and we kind of had about 3-4 months, more than that actually. We spent about 5-6 months iteratively going through each version of the proposal, going back to the site, talking with people, talking with local politicians, talking with workers, making three-dimensional models, making calculations repeatedly, and then finally executing it at some point of time. But this gave us the confidence to move forward and see what we can do with ideas of this kind. And Wipro Foundation very generously came forward to support more such projects. And we got very excited. And in the process of putting together more ideas, we actually ran into trouble, which is when actually what I was saying a moment ago about tactical urbanist projects and highly scaled up urban interventions as the main pathways actually hit us in the face. the government was actually very impressed by the outcomes in the in the site which I just showed you, and they asked us to work on 120 projects like this across the city. And that we thought was a scary idea. We jumped into it, but we knew that we were going to fall on our face. There's no way we could actually undertake 120 projects at one go because the approach was basically handcrafting. Right? You go into the place, you embed yourself in it, you talk to people, spend a lot of time on site, then figure out how to build it up. Now, if you have that kind of time and energy and resources, only of this kind in many places at one go. So what we did was to start a program called iLocal, Imagining Low Cost Action Lab. And in that program, we started actually experimenting with generating ideas and implementing them in one or two locations. So the first ones I'll just show you. This is the one that I just showed you a moment ago. Um, this is what it'll look like. If you can all see the images, you will see on the right-hand top corner, you have the slope of the hill, which was full of rocks, which was very, very difficult to come down from all of that. And in the other three images, you
Anand,
see,
can you just increase the magnification or go to full screen? I think that might be easier for participants.
is this better?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. So the images that you're seeing here, so the first one is this, which is the slope. And then you have the same area, which changed over the next few months gradually. And what we did, and this was the most important lesson for us, that there are a number of children who wanted something for themselves. There were a number of women who wanted something for themselves from that. And each of these different stakeholders actually pushed us to think and rethink how we were going to do this. So many surprising things emerged in the process. So on the along the way, when we were building this staircase, after third day, one old gentleman actually walked down the staircase from one of the houses at the top, and he said, "You guys have done something amazing. I have a friend who lives just down this hill, and I haven't seen him in the last 8 years because I can't go all around the hill. I'm going to go and see him physically in person for the first time." And he sat down and cried. There was another gentleman who said that he'd been trying to get married for a long time, and he was just not able to find anyone who would be willing to enter into any kind of marital alliance with him simply because he lived in such a inaccessible place. And he said that things are going to change. What was fun was that we added blackboards onto the walls, we added paintings onto the walls, and we added plants into the area. And that completely changed the way in which the neighborhood actually worked. Now, this ended up actually inspiring a lot of neighborhoods in the same area saying that we want something like this done in our area also. And over a period of time, actually, some of them went ahead and raised funds from wherever they could, got the municipal corporation to put some resources into it and built something like this for themselves. So this is one example. The second one that I wanted to show you is this site, the Singareni colony. Um, yeah. Singareni colony is a very, very interesting place. I mean, I was talking a little while ago about water bodies across the city. Singareni colony is actually Singareni Coal Mines Officers Colony, along with two other middle class, kind of affluent. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, the idea of affluence was very different. These were retiring government employees who purchased land through societies that they formed, and they ended up actually purchasing land that was belonging in part to the tank called Sarur Nagar tank. So it ended up in all kinds of court cases, litigations of various kinds, all kinds of fights, and in the middle of it, a large number of squatters settled into the area and there was a fire accident, and at the end of it, the government said that they were going to build Valmiki Ambedkar Yojana housing, and they built about 2,000 houses. Now, as it happens in many of these kinds of cases, the government basically legitimized the ownership of this land as their own. This land may actually be belonging partly into the lake itself. We don't know. Those documents are not easily accessible anymore. But the government built G+3 housing in the area. There were 4,000 families. They built 2,000 units. But as this was happening, more people thought that there would be more housing built. And so another 4,000 families came in. So essentially what has happened over a period of time is that thousands of families have settled all around this in various kinds of slum settlements. Some of them are in a terrible condition. Some of them are slightly better off. And then you have this government built housing in the area. This was built in 2005. And since then, not a rupee has been spent in repair, maintenance, etc. on this. And during the lockdown, with a lot of garbage being thrown out of houses, from the windows, from the balconies, a lot of open spaces completely became buried under waste. And what we found was that children were playing in the in this garbage. They were getting bitten by rodents, by mosquitoes. Drinking water was getting contaminated in all kinds of ways. And this was the kind of space into which we entered. So what did we do? We got the place cleaned up. And once the garbage was cleaned up, we turned that area into a more accessible space. We put two blackboards onto the wall like we did in the earlier case. And in general, it has now kind of become a pattern for us that we're realizing that a lot of neighborhoods have children going to schools where their families are not able to support them at home in their education. Their houses are too small and too dingy for them to study at home at night. They need open, spacious learning spaces in their neighborhoods. So the idea now is two types. One is to create open learning walls in neighborhoods. The idea now is to try and create opportunities for garbage-free childhood, play areas, and I'll show you in a moment another place where play actually became a very, very important element. We built this, but as we were building this, unlike in the previous case where the entire community kind of slowly over a period of time got together, here local leaderships of various kinds jumped in and said that this cannot go on, this has to be stopped. And it ended up in all kinds of very bitter fights, arguments over a period of time. And then at some point of time, the work was kind of abandoned for about 4 or 5 months. And now, after a long gap, we are kind of returning to work on this site again, because now it's looked like a number of people are again feeling the need for doing something better. The third one is an interesting site, which is on the edge of a massive water body called Miralam Tank, about 700 acres of land. And in this, you have a couple of slums on the edge of the tank on a hill slope. And the hill is completely inundated by garbage of various kinds, sewage of various kinds, and all that. The place was actually filled with kikad trees. And when we first visited the site, we thought that we should just clean up the place up a little bit and actually have music days organized there. But as we began to think about what could be done with places of this kind, the community which lived there came and said that we really want something for our children. And that's how the whole idea of turning this into a better place for the community's use itself began. So as you can see, there is a wall dividing this area, completely blocking off the entire slum behind it. And what happened over the first few months of this year, by around March, April, we kind of finished this work, is that the area was kind of terraced, and in the terraced hill slope, there's a shed and a platform that got created. And it looks quite beautiful now. You can climb up to the hill slope from one side. And once you enter there, you have a place for performance, for play, for all kinds of activities. And places used by men in the morning, by around 10:30, 11, women from the slums come and sit there and do their work, which, as we're finding increasingly, many slums in cities have now become very, very congested because there's no new money coming into slums from the government, no new infrastructure being created. So people are just kind of going on building and building and building, inwardly building into slums. And so it's very congested. So this is a massive breathing space for the people there, and they are learning to own it. It is not easy for people who have never owned anything. In fact, one of the most fascinating things for us was that when people asked us, "Can you run some training programs here?" I said, "Place is yours. Why will we run?" And many of them laughed and said that, when you don't have anything, you don't know how to ask. But when you have something, you begin to gain confidence. You begin to ask for new things to be delivered. So as that began, what we started doing, and now I'm going to quickly run through the remaining part of this presentation. Um, Earlier this year, we ran a competition because one of the things that we realized is that there are 2 or 3 very different kinds of groups that have to be working on this. One is the community, where you need to understand the politics of the community, the leaders, the leadership's own concerns, their connections to local politicians, etc. And then you have the bureaucracy, which is very often struggling with questions of how do you do procurement for small projects, etc. And then you need someone who also is a little bit more than a maestri, in the sense that it should be someone who understands form, it should be someone who understands function, it should be a designer or an architect, but someone who can work with masons and understand their language, their constraints, and so on. And that has been a big, big challenge in getting any of these things executed. So what we ended up doing was to run an international competition for ideas. And that international competition for ideas basically gave us 450 participants from across the world, turning in ideas for 10 sites, about 55 entries, from which we selected 17 entries, and we put them all together as projects that potentially can go forward. What are these places like? And these places, actually, some of the sites were suggested by the government officers themselves, who, as part of the MOU we signed with the government, essentially said that let's try and see if we can find locations that we want improved. So what do we have? We have slums, we have parks, we have open air locations in the city, we have places under flyovers, we have rocks, rock pools, caves, old bus stands, the abandoned bus stops, all kinds of locations. We put them all together, and this is an old police station which is in disuse now. It must have been built about 100 years ago. There are a number of police outposts in the city now, which are about 400 square feet total in size, with some granite and some brick and mortar construction. Nice open buildings, but very often completely abandoned and in bad state of disrepair, with a very interesting groups of people all around them. So some of the ideas were about how to repurpose them, rework them, and so on. So 10 sites, 17 ideas, and a fairly intensive workshopping of ideas over a few months. And we put those ideas together, and then we published all of them. This is the compendium that you see. I can share this compendium with you at some point of time, whoever wants to see it. And these are the locations from where the entries came. Um, and all of these ideas, when they were put together, we realized that we had the beginnings of some very interesting projects, but they needed much more work to be actually implementable, because governments want to know how much money is going to be spent. CSR is going to know how much money can be actually spent, what is going to be impact, etc. So we ran another workshop in which we said, okay, so let's take the selected ideas and then work on them further to turn them into executable ideas. At this point of time, we have all of these ideas slowly building up into executable form, and we are in conversation with government, and we are very optimistic that a few of these projects will actually eventually be executed. In fact, within the next couple of weeks or so, the processes will begin. What we are worried about at this point of time is that, and we're kind of walking into it with full awareness, that the government is often willing to put money into infrastructure creation. Um, they can figure out how to spend small amounts of money, but they're going to put that money only into infrastructure creation, into repairing, etc. But there's no money for operations, there's no money for programming and so on. And programming and operations are so important for this work, because if you don't have money for creating commoning practices, if you don't have money to hold the community together, if you don't have money to invent and create new communities around these places, the whole thing will collapse in no time. So what we are trying to do now is to figure out how to put the money together to support the afterlife of creation of small neighborhood infrastructures, and make that process somehow manageable in such a way that it can eventually take us to a place where we can report on the impact of these things, and then make the case that you actually need to put money into operations, because this can have long-term consequences for women and children. And we know that it does have long-term consequences, because we have seen it in at least 3 projects. And we are hoping that we will be able to methodologically figure out how to do this. Now, I'm now at this point of time, I'm just going to close this and go back to my previous slides. You can see this if you want later, I can pull it out. But to go back to my previous presentation, my previous slides. Yeah. At some level, to me, there are a number of ways in which one can theorize, conceptualize this, and think about what to do. I can think in terms of the challenges of pedagogy. How do we teach students of architecture or students of social work or community leaders to think about neighborhoods and locations with all of their specificity, about which we have become so skeptical in the last 20, 30 years. I mean, nobody really has any faith in anything local as it interfaces with practices of government. In that kind of a situation, where can we go, right? So there's questions of pedagogy. There are questions of how do we create these kinds of assets and return them to communities as shared commons, right? These are communities which don't exist, but we have to be creating those communities. But in the end, those communities should be able to hold on to them. And that is when placemaking actually becomes a meaningful exercise in our cities. Second, in many ways, it seems to me that the kind of wisdom that we had, I'm not saying that John Turner's ideas were fantastic and that they solved everything in our cities, but in the 80s were in some ways the golden period of slums in Hyderabad city. We had a number of sites that were identified by the government, notified, and the government essentially said that we're going to put money into this for creating infrastructure, which they called sites and services. We'll provide some services, we'll create some infrastructure, and then give some kind of a provisional title to the people who can occupy and build on these sites. So these provisional titles are titles where you can't actually sell the property to anyone else. You can transfer it to your children. It can be inherited, but beyond that, it cannot enter the regular market as landed property. And there have been a lot of struggles against that. There's a lot of pushback. There's also no property tax on any of these things. It's meant to be housing for low-income families, and generation after generation of people have lived in them, moved out, new people have moved in, and a lot of world has actually emerged from these places. That kind of support for auto construction, incremental construction, autonomy has gone out of most slums now. The government policy is actually not supporting any of it. Because if until 1970s, the government of India said that the government will build housing and hand it over to the poor. Now the government largely believes that the market will deliver housing to the poor, and it's very clear that just as the government at that point of time was not able to deliver housing, the market is not able to deliver housing to the to people either. So you do have a big problem in our slums, and like I said, a lot of congestion has begun to build up, and it's becoming it is reaching a point where it's actually very dangerous. And in a situation like that, this kind of neighborhood infrastructure creation, claiming small pieces of land, handing them over to people, even if it is placed under the road overpass, is an amazingly important policy intervention that can happen. We need to figure out how to make it happen, but if the moment we craft that actual mechanisms, it can be an amazing resource for dealing with our problems in our city. And these kinds of solutions then,
Honestly, I
because
have
they
about
will
five
have
more
active
minutes.
inputs from people, because they will have active. Yeah, I'm just closing in a minute.
Sure. Yeah.
Given these kinds of knowledges, what we can actually expect is that given extreme heat conditions, extreme precipitations, which are resulting in floods and so on, all of these kinds of things can actually be somewhat mitigated, if not actually anticipated and responded to through these kinds of intervention. Finally, we're talking about places in Hyderabad, for example. There are more than 1,000 locations that the municipal corporation calls garbage vulnerable points. All of these garbage vulnerable points are basically odd shaped pieces of land, which are obviously old commons, agrarian commons, which have been left over as the built environment expanded, which nobody is interested even in encroaching on, because the location is so wrong for encroachment, that they are locations for throwing garbage. They are locations where all kinds of negative values attached to them, inhere in them. And what we are attempting to do in these kinds of experiments, because we know that young people, children in these areas are saying that we want playgrounds, we want libraries, we want reading rooms. People are asking for things, and creating those kinds of resources for these places temporarily, provisionally, just like you give housing through provisional titling, creating community assets which are provisional, which can be pulled down anytime, which do not violate the idea of family silver, I think is one direction in which we should be moving. And I'm listing out these three as possible theoretical conceptual frames through which we can look at it. I can imagine many ways of doing this. And the only way we can actually move forward with something like this is by experimenting a lot more, trying to see where we can borrow practices from. I'm not a great votary of best practices being moved from one place to another, but I do think that ideas can be translated from one context to another context. So I think it's be really great if we can pull that off. So I'm just going to stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but I would really love to hear ideas, suggestions, and wherever else people want to take them.
Thank you, Anand. So I didn't mean to, if you had more time to put together something, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to continue for a while. I didn't mean to stop you at that point. Uh, we already have a few questions to begin with. So there are three questions from perhaps one, perhaps the same, or perhaps different anonymous attendees, but they come from roughly a similar space. So I'll try and put them together in one structure. The first is, I think, be useful to, if you have a sense of defining community, uh, um, locals, knowledge partners, and research organizations. So how would you sort of define community and their practice would be the first sort of issue in some sense. And then whether, given the interventions and given that I presume, given that the nature of the land doesn't change, uh, the attendee asks, are not the state actors the true beneficiary of this particular process? And what kind of uncertainty and future trajectories do you foresee in this process of recommoning the place that, as you are sort of looking outside? Sort of, if you can speculate on that, that is one kind of issues. The second is, so why don't you take that, because it's a set of questions, and then we'll start with the other set as it goes forward.
Okay, so I will actually start with the first question, which is how do I define community and its practice? It is locals, knowledge partners, research organization, etc. To me, as I said right up front, the community is not something that is already existing. It's not there. It has to be brought into being through commoning practices, right? It has to be brought into being through sharing practices, through translations of various kinds. And that's the only way to move forward. Because if we expect a pre-existing community which is coherent, which is homogeneous in some way, which can speak for itself, we are going to be deeply disappointed. And so what we realized is that all communities are deeply divided. They are broken. They're more so more so difficultly in the city, because we actually don't know how the breaking actually has occurred, at what point of time, what are the fault lines. It takes a lot of time to figure out all of those things. So what we normally in our practice have done is to tentatively identify a need that people feel and build around it and let the community emerge around it, because then eventually somehow through the material process of working out some kind of a response to a need in the area, things will emerge. So that's the reason why we actually, in our contest brief, we asked people to define some kind of a social purpose, goal, function that needs to be met or served by, and then figure out the infrastructure for that. Because in that process of saying that this is what we need and allowing it to be critiqued, challenged by people, the actual design process begins to shape. And that's the most exciting part of it. It's very uncertain. It is scary at times, but it's also something that reveals a lot. So to me, research actually happens through all of this kind of process. Knowledge partners, yes and no, in the sense that a lot of the times, knowledge partners have to walk into these places being completely open to learn on their feet. You don't, for example, have a total station survey data available for a site. So you walk in, and I remember in Miralam Tank area, we had someone who had a good sense of what the place is like, walk in with a piece of paper and plot physically by walking up and down the hill slope to estimate the heights, because we just can't afford to get a TLS total station survey done. That's how it is done. Yeah. Um, how do we identify our role as a bridging actor in these interventions? Are state actors not the true beneficiaries? State actors could be beneficiaries. We know that state actors are actually fascinated by this, because it does look like a small amount of investment for something really, really big. And it's true that actually if the government can back it. But as I said, governments have now reached a point where they don't know how to spend small amounts of money. They don't know how to do small things. And that's where our role actually comes in, that we are saying that we are here. We can make this process of imagining something small that is functional, something that is accessible and used by people. actually possible. So in some sense, this is a question of building enough trust amongst all actors, and that's not an easy thing. I mean, nobody trusts you, you don't trust anyone. That's how we have built our cities. Our cities are full of mistrusting, distrusting people, and there's no gainsaying that fact. That's what it is. Would you call recombining through placemaking as a future pathways? Yes, in some ways, yes. Exactly what I mean in the sense that to me, for the longest time, the commons as a category which is outside of public property and private property. That's where the great potential actually lies, because a lot of environmental fights in our cities, if you notice, they end up in courts for long periods of litigation, and often with a lot of bad blood, with a lot of mistrust on all sides, because they're fought about whether a piece of land is public property or private property. And in the process of fighting for the property, and claiming it for the public, we actually forget that even if it is the public, you could still go and mess it up because you're actually using the wrong technology for building. You're using wrong materials. You are doing things that should not be done in those places. I mean, today, over the years, with so many court cases going on, and the government often saying that they are actually trying to save water bodies everywhere. What we have is about 80 to 90% of all the thousands of water bodies in the city are ring bunded, which means that they have lost their literal zones, which in Telugu local parlance is called Cheru Shikham, which is basically the shallow water area of the lake where you find from October onwards all the migratory birds coming in, because that's where the food is, that's where the most nutritious soil is. That's gone now because we built roads to protect property. So we are saying that whether you're thinking of climate change, whether you're thinking of sustainability of communities, whether you're thinking about climate justice, recommoning is the pathway to a better future. Should neighborhood level public open spaces such as lakes embrace the
Yeah,
dichotomy of reserve?
let me just take a group, three of them, Anand. So
Sure.
the first, as Soumya Mushrif asks, is
Partho, do you want me to add those participants in?
no, that's fine. At the moment, we are. If you want to ask directly, Soumya, would you like to
She
make
can't,
this?
she can't speak right now, so I can
Yeah,
add
okay.
her
So
and then.
let's finish this then. Then the core issue is the way you have presented this particular commons. Uh, it's been local, but obviously there will be some commons, especially let's say, which may actually have extra local effects, because
Yeah.
obviously every common site is located in and around a particular space, but if it's actually commons and it's accessible to the broader city, and how does that sort of affect the way in which governance is of those commons sort of puts together? And related to that is Vanshika's question, which is about when you're thinking about O&M and structures, you mentioned the fact that the O&M is an issue. Uh, does it make sense to develop a typology of the life of operations to get a sense of exactly how the O&M process works, and therefore thinking through how the financing structure comes through? Uh, these two, and the next question, I think by Rituparna is, and I'll
Yes, sir.
sort of, yes,
So, am I audible?
yes, you're audible.
So, actually, I have been like dealing with this mic for some time. The speaker, I think I'm having some technical issues from my side. So,
You're
sir, it's
fine.
okay. I
You're
would.
audible now, so you can go ahead, and I'm curious to see which part of Beck and Giddens Risk Society you want to
Uh,
emphasize.
Yes, sir. Actually, I was pretty interested in this whole topic that you presented on today, our invited speaker. So, actually, I have a lot of curiosity regarding the whole urban space itself, like the whole idea of urban sociology. Because I am from sociology background, it is very contemporary. At the same time, it's a burning issue, but still, the notions and all the emotional side, or maybe the social relationship side, everything about urban space is very very subtle. It looks very subtle, but yet they are very prominent. So sir, I actually wanted to know, since you have been dealing with this whole urban scenario, how do exactly common people reduce risks in the society, if we understand risk in terms of what Beck had talked about? Because when we say about reducing risk, or say insecurities of an urban space, we normally look at the, the authority figures, or let's say the government, or anybody who is in power. So what can common people do to reduce risk?
Yeah.
And
Partha, do you want?
uh, Anant, let me just also quickly add on one more aspect, since um, one of the core issues about when you move into the risk society from the other society is the lack of trust in expertise,
Yeah.
and the tension that sort of happens within that particular space. So, which is in some sense, you mentioned what happened in the Singarini case, where people sort of are putting some of that structure together. So, do you see that as one of the issues in terms of when you're thinking about discussing options around the placemaking? What kind of issues you want to address around that? And uh, the question that Vanshika asks, and Shruti has a similar question about how do you keep up the maintenance story, the O&M story going forward. So maybe that is another broad area that you might want to address within these stories. So the risk story, the maintenance story, and then the story around the local and the city level structures. So three broad issues for you to engage with. If any of the people whose questions I have sort of paraphrased would like to sort of think I've done it improperly, please raise your hand and we'll sort of just put you. Anybody who wants to speak, just raise your hand and we'll bring
Yeah,
them in.
I've added all the folks who've
Okay,
put in questions as speakers so they can
sure,
just unmute
sure.
themselves.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, go ahead, Anand.
Partha, you'll have to give me about 20 seconds because there is a azan going on here, and you'll probably not be able to hear my voice at all.
No, we can hear you
You
perfectly,
hear it
actually.
Okay.
quite well. And
All right.
if there's a sound in the background, that's fine. Yeah,
All right.
go
So the
ahead.
azan is not reaching you. Fine. So I just quickly deal with the easier questions first, and then come to the more uh, um, questions that require a little more careful thinking. Yes, there are infrastructures which function at a city level, or at the level of they're on the borders of various administrations, right? The main thing actually about any infrastructure question in the city is that it lies at under multiple jurisdictions. It could be revenue department versus the municipal administration. It could be between two municipal wards. Um, uh, it could be between different engineering wards within the municipal corporation. All of these kinds of things are always there. So one part of this is about trying to figure out how to work with these various agencies and getting things done. One part of this is about how to make the thing actually functional on the ground. My own sense, and I'm not saying that this is an answer that will work everywhere, is that these are projects where we are in some sense actually engaging with the city at the end of some kind of a moment of resignation. I remember very well Partha at some point of time in one of our conversations saying that, look, we should actually give up on large cities in terms of democracy at the local level, because these are cities in which decisions are taken by big capital, big money investments, big calculations about what can be done in the city, right? And True. But still, under the metro rail, there is a small piece of land. There is a small corner that is actually used by people. Right next to this thing called the blue and green infrastructure. On the edge of it, there are all kinds of things going on. There are rocks, boulders, there are small nooks, crannies, rock pools around which things are happening. And those are things that can actually be made to function differently from what is happening currently, right? At the other end, where there are all of these different kinds of things to be resolved, we do have to work with the government, and that's precisely the reason why we engage with governments. Yeah, so that I'm just going to leave it at that. We can come back to it if we want to think about it again in a slightly different way. There are, for example, the whole question of large flyovers and the space below that is exactly that, right? The flyover belongs to the whole city, but the space below that is abandoned and nobody is using it, or sometimes it's completely occupied by all kinds of competing functions. Um, Vanshika, I totally agree with you. We do need to create typologies of lives of operation. I know that at least some architecture teachers have been attempting to work on what they call repairing cities, which is basically to try and figure out how to create inventories of repair work that need to be done in places like the one Singareni colony which I just showed you, right? 20 years, 15 years of 20 years of complete neglect. You have everything, all the nuts and bolts coming off. How do you repair a place like that? Each individual, each household does something. They get a small part of it repaired, but it actually does require something more than that. So we do need to figure out methodologies for making inventories of work that needs to be done. We need to figure out methodologies for turning them into works that can be procured, into works for which we can create bill of quantities. All kinds of things that need to be done. There's engineering work to be done here, and there is a social life of worlds of life of material things that we need to work through. So it's a fascinating space where there is much work that needs to be done. And the most exciting part of that is actually opening up right now is the possibility of, let's say, something like wastewater surveillance, right? What do you do in the city where everything is actually swimming with pathogens of various kinds, right? So that's the quick answer to that. Um, the bigger questions of risk, whether you think of it in terms of LRIC or think in terms of communities and how they're perceiving these things. My own interest in climate change actually began with the conversation around the question of risk. And I am often very puzzled when I look at the Sustainable Development Goals, in which climate change is one of the climate change risk mitigation is one of the goals, amongst many other things. I want to make sure that everybody gets enough food. And by the way, climate change might mean that the planet might end in about 60 years time from now. We really don't know. So how do we deal with this? In a situation like that, one of the things that we've realized repeatedly is that we actually don't have methods at this point of time to tap into knowledges of risk that people themselves have. We don't know how to document it. We don't know how to record it. We don't know how to turn that into usable knowledge, because we end up actually thinking about risk either from the state point of view or from the point of view of the market. And those are spaces of calculation which are very different from the spaces of calculation in which people live. You get up in the morning, you don't know whether you're going to get water or not in your house. You go to collect water, you might slip and fall and actually injure yourself. Your child might go out and play and come back with a terrible stomach. All kinds of things are always risky in our neighborhoods. The question is then, what are communities themselves doing? What are people themselves doing? Do they have a sense of what needs to be done? Do they have recipes? Do they have solutions? Which is where I think that a lot of the work that needs to be done has to be in the language of finding recipes as responses to risk. Because people are finding solutions. They have to live, right? They can't give up on life and go away. So how do we deal with it? I think that is where the most important methodological innovations have to happen. And I mean, we can talk about it at some point of time, some of the kinds of experiments that have happened at Hyderabad Urban Lab and other places across the country in terms of how to actually capture what people are thinking, how to document it, how to put it all together as a body of knowledge. Partha, is there something else that I have missed?
Mukta is taking over from now. I think you're good with that set of.
Yeah, I think Aditya's question, because he didn't type it in the Q&A box. So maybe Aditya, if you would still hear, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay.
Yeah, Aditya, are you coming in?
I was just saying that I didn't actually ask a question, so it
You
might
raised
be
your hand.
someone
You
else.
raised your hand.
Oh, by accident. Apologies.
Oh, okay, okay. I mean, normally raising hands is also a legitimate way of asking questions. Harsh,
Mhm. I just
Sushruti's
want
question.
to say
Hmm.
to Lorraine, my answer is yes. She asked, "At of eviction, do you think that building community assets like the ones you described here can provide some level of protection?" Yes, it does.
A-
But you don't
And
talk about that.
if you want to elaborate a bit on that, Anand, as to how it, sort of, or rather, why you're answering yes. What are the kinds of processes or changes that you might think are going into that sort of increased level or decreased level of precarity?
Sorry, I got disconnected for a moment.
So I was basically asking you to elaborate on what your answer to Lorraine is to, if you can speculate as
Yeah,
to the pathways through how that decreased level of precarity sort of comes in.
yeah. So essentially, what we are imagining is this. I mean, this is something that will take a little bit of time, but essentially, what we are imagining is this. We are saying that you have a squatter settlement here, and that squatter settlement has a number of children who are playing in garbage, and we are not asking for property rights to the squatter settlement to the squatters, but we're saying give these children a garbage-free playing area. Now, is this going to then give the parents of these children a better chance at negotiating with the state? Um, Not necessarily in terms of saying that we will not be evicted from here, right? But what they can do is that they do have a much better chance of making an argument as to why they are there. And I think that it's important to give people that space of dignity, that space of a claim, that space of altering the arguments about places. Because very often, what happens about places that ought to be evicted um, is that these are dirty places, these are bad places, these are negative places, and therefore they have to be moved out. I mean, I still remember one amazing conversation between a senior IAS officer with a slum dweller in Hyderabad, where the slum dweller was told that, we're going to move you into a new place, and we're going to turn this into a beautiful park. And 5 years down the line, 10 years down the and you will come here, look at it, and you will feel so happy about it because you will see how beautiful it is. And this man basically looked at him almost incredulously and said, "Sir, but this is where my children peed and shat, and that's what I will remember when I come back and look at it." Right? We made this place what it is. And I think that at some level, being able to use places meaningfully, being able to gain some kind of dignity through places. I mean, just imagine how much difference it makes for a place to have a reading room. A need that I kept hearing again and again and again everywhere in all the slums where I talk to young women, 15, 16-year-old girls, they're all saying reading room. They're all saying playgrounds. They're just not there, accessible to them. So whether they are going to get immediate rights into the property or not is a different matter. But I do think that they will become better stakeholders in the city by gaining these even these temporary things. And that's a very important intervention from that point of view for me.
Uh, Two quick. One, there's a question from NJ about the pedagogical possibilities that you are of these kinds of projects. That's one broad issue that sort of comes through. The second, I'll take. Aditya seems to have finally thought of his question, which is the relationship between precarity, commoning, and community. I mean, do you, in your sense, it moves from commoning to community, but is it possible to move in some sense in the other direction too? And which is also sort of related in part to Andrew's question, which is you're looking at the small hyperlocal public spaces, but do you see any other pathways of creating these kinds of spaces going forward? So these two broad kinds of themes that are there, which is uh, and Raj Sahu also in that sense asks the same questions about how about thinking of frequently used ordinary shared urban resources, which are
Yeah.
not sort of, the street as public space in some sense, which has been a oft used description in that structure going forward. So this way in which you think about the commoning and the public spaces and how that can extend beyond the hyperlocal, and the issue around pedagogy. These are two broad issues if we can address to begin with.
Yeah. So just in terms of pedagogy, one of the things that we realized in the process of working on these kind of projects is that in community level work, whether they are policy students of public policy, whether they are organically growing community leaders, almost everyone has difficulty in engaging with local places. People don't know exactly how to live with the awkwardness of walking into a place, talking to people, becoming aware of all the tensions, all the contradictions, and becoming one of those contradictions in the place. And I think that it's very important for us to remember that um, if you look at any of the old bureaucrat training, IAS officers training of very early periods, they were all about officers being on the street. You'd spend lots of time on the street in communities to figure out what those processes are. And I think that over a period of time, we have lost that ability to actually be able to understand the incomprehensible of the community, because the community can seem like a black box. It can seem like a coherent unit. It can seem like it's unreasonable, but it is what it is. And so you have to walk into those places, make sense of it, turn something of it into an entity that you can work with, an entity that will shape you as you go along. I mean, this is something that we discovered in our own work when people would tell us in the beginning that, look, we don't trust you, you're academics. You're here to exploit data from us, extract data from us. You will go and publish it. But if publishing is all that you want, then why are you looking for any kind of truth in these places? And we had to keep telling them that, look, we're not going away anywhere. We are here, we'll make mistakes, we'll make terrible judgments, mistakes in judgment. But because we are here, we're willing to take that risk because just like you can make mistakes, we can make mistakes. Let's try and figure out how to do it. It's a different pedagogy of practice that I think is very important for us to learn and figure out how to bring it back into our institutions. The second issue has to do with actually how architecture is taught. There's no school of architecture today in India, and I can say this all very confidently, which actually teaches people how to repair, which actually teaches people how to build on what is already existing. People are trained to build on greenfield sites. People are trained to build something new. They don't quite know how to do anything with something which is already existing, which is in a state of bad disrepair, which is full of all kinds of contradictions. And I think that that is a very, very important challenge in terms of how do we teach people building sciences, the arts of building or the built environment. So I'm saying, as you can see, that from the point of view of the built environment and from the point of view of society, there is a direction, there's a way in which we'll have to do pedagogy that is facing both ways. Both need to be critiqued. For both, we need to come up with new ways of teaching and new ways of learning together. That's the question about. That's my response to the pedagogy question. The question about precarity and community and commoning, I'm not sure I understand the question fully, but I will quickly say what I think about precarity, right? I mean, one of the early work that I had done was actually about this question of precarity. About 2012, 2013, around the same time as when I began to think about commons and land in the city. And the question was that this thing called precarity, which is often divorced from the original Marxist idea of the precariat as a group of people who actually cannot become a class unto themselves in any way, right? They don't have even have a proper shared set of interests, are taken to be people without any politics of their own. There are no socialities within them. They are basically a whole bunch of people who are scattered, who don't get connected to each other. And I was very skeptical about that idea of precarity and precariat. I wanted to very carefully look at what are the socialities amongst these people called the precariat or people who are living under conditions of precarity. And what I discovered was that there are all kinds of very interesting ways in which people are crafting their persona with some degree of detachment, with some strategies of accumulating resources, of preparing for some kind of risk that they can't fully understand. They know that they're vulnerable and they're trying to put things together to make life viable. It's people of this kind from whom you actually have to create or craft this thing called the commons of the community. And I think that it's very, very possible to do that. It's tough, it's very challenging because there are actually large, powerful vested interests in keeping people in such precarious conditions, in people finding and creating communities of their own. Because politically, it's very easy to deal with a lot of individuals. We don't want to deal with communities and commons. And I think that's where actually the possibilities and promise of this kind of work actually lies. Um, does that does that answer everything, Partha?
Yes, at one level, though, you have Andrew's story on the hyperlocal, and both Raj and Andrew's, the whole story about moving from the hyperlocal to the broader citywide normal normal streets, can one imagine these as, and which I think is also in some sense about the commoning story, about can you sort of, uh, in your examples, in your descriptions, it is about sort of either spaces which are not used or used for rather uh, sort of uh, not unuseful purpose. Some dumping garbage is, of course, a useful purpose at one level, but it is, uh, but spaces which are currently being used in a particular fashion. And I'm reminded, in some sense, of Jogjakarta's practice of how the shopping in the morning, you have on the street, you have shops and the sort of under the verandas, under the porticos, you basically have a whole bunch of shops. And then in the evening, that place is completely transformed into uh, something around eating joints and so on and so forth. Right? So the spaces are sort of have multi uses over time because they're taken over in that particular space by the community. So um, I suppose what I'm taking away from Andrew and Raj, and please jump in if you think that um, I'm mischaracterizing what you're saying, is do you want to sort of, that's one of the issues that can be put together. Andrew, I'll bring you in a second. And the second issue is one of by Yamini, who wants to talk about uh, including community perspectives into thinking about risk. So when you're thinking about risk, and also one of the issues I thought you might want to, if you're going to go back to the risk story, is the idea, and you alluded to it in some extent in the fact that when you spoke about your positionality as an academic researcher and how people view it. Is there, do you see contestation around what is to be done? At a broader level, of course, on climate change, etc., there are competing viewpoints about where we are coming from. But at that local level at which you are doing these kinds of placemaking, are there different perceptions of what is risk and what is risky in that sense going forward? So that's another issue that you can put in place. And let me just bring in Andrew. I think he had he wanted to sort of ask the question himself. So let me just do that for a second.
Sorry. Just to be very quick, I was thinking more about informality because so much of what we are talking about now is working in slums and informal settlements. I just want to know, we know that this sort of acupuncture method seems to be useful for working in informal settlements and slums, which is very different from sort of formal parts of our city. So I'm just thinking, do you see any other ways that these kinds of spaces can be made, things that aren't hyperlocal, things that aren't acupuncture? And I suppose broadly, I'm just asking about how the regime of planning and formality and informality affects these kinds of public, open, all of these kinds of shared common spaces.
And Raj also wants to intervene. Please go ahead, Raj.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I'll be very quick. First of all, I would like to refer to the classic work Eleanor Armstrong, The Governing of the Commons Collective Action Institution. Now, as I was wandering through that, that the user is always there, whether it is the GBP or whether it is the street where someone is parking the vehicle, therefore part of the public space is gone into a particular kind of use. So in that context, I was, and you mentioned about also segregation norms in solid waste management, which is actually a law. It's the citizen or the user is mandated by law to segregate. And therefore, if you do not segregate your waste, somehow that is entering into the environment in the form of waste, litter, or whatever we could call it. And therefore, they find their space in such kind of, let's say, storm water drainage or the corner of the street, which nobody cares to look at all. So, and in this sense, many of these ordinary spaces are often exploited. But in one of the examples which you shared, that in that slum settlement community, that space has now a different kind of usage where children are playing, maybe senior citizens are there spending some leisure time. So yeah, so in that context, how would you react to it? Thank you.
Okay. Partha, should I start answering?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so let me just quickly start with Andrew's question. Andrew, the way I have been thinking about this is actually that there's always an attempt to bring interesting ideas into formal spaces. And very often when we attempt to bring something into the formal space, we actually kill the idea completely. Simply because we often misunderstand the nature of what is happening as um, informal and therefore very distinct and different and unconnected to or outside of the boundaries of the formal. It's never like that. There are all kinds of formal and informal intermeshings that are happening. What I do think is that one of the promises of this kind of work is that to retain the whether you call it hyperlocal or local or meso or whatever name you want to give, depending on the size of it that you are privileging. I think that often things happen through mimicry, right? Somebody in Bombay decided to put a basketball court under a flyover. And now every politician and every bureaucrat in the city is trying to figure out what to do with the space under the flyover. Nobody has said that, look, you have a lot of water that is getting collected and draining off of the road overpass. Is there a way in which we can create some kind of rainwater harvesting structure under the flyover? But if someone did say that, it might actually catch on. And I'm saying that in some ways, what happens in cities like ours is that there is a lot of mimicry. A good idea or a bad idea sometimes just gets picked up. People want to copy it. People want to replicate it. People want to find ways of doing it elsewhere. And I think we need to actually think about those as strategies rather than strategies of trying to figure out how to scale up something and do it in 50 other places at the same time. I don't have to do it. Other people will do it. People are going to be excited about it. People are going to find these ideas interesting, useful. They will translate it into something else. What we can do is to put the necessary system of values, DNA into each intervention when you first do it and hope that that will travel. And this is where that question of pedagogy is so important, right? So you train people. You have people who know exactly how to think about these things. And that's very important. So now we actually have at least 15, 20 people who have done these kinds of things, have understood what are the tensions with communities, what are the challenges with architectural training, what are the challenges with materials markets. And that experience is what is going to make it possible to take it to all kinds of places, including formal spaces. Yeah, that's my quick response to it. I don't know if it is answering your question fully or not, but that's what I can offer. Um, yeah, is someone saying something? I missed something?
No, go ahead, Anand.
Yeah. Okay. So the second question is about garbage segregation, the law about garbage. Yes and no, in the sense that um, we all know that garbage handling is a question of behavioral change. What we often don't pay attention to is the fact that it is also a design question, right? Very often, I mean, for the last few years in Hyderabad, we have not had dumpsters anywhere because the city at some point of time took a strange policy decision that we will be a dumpster free, bin free city. And that basically meant that no neighborhood actually has any kind of a public bin. And in many places, it's actually very difficult for families to do segregation at home. Even if they do segregation at home, uh, Just imagine you're going to take a lot of vegetable waste, put it into a plastic bag, tie it up nicely, and then throw it out, right? And that actually becomes extremely dangerous when it goes into any place, including the regular organic waste yard, because it's going to rot and it is not going to compost in any meaningful way. If it gets into any kind of water stream, it becomes an extremely dangerous choking, blocking thing. It's dangerous. And yet we don't ever seem to be thinking that there is a problem with the way in which we have designed our garbage disposal systems and the items that you need to dispose of garbage meaningfully at home after segregation, right? We don't have bins, we don't have any kind of supportive system. At the end of it, what can people do? Which is not to say that people cannot actually be pushed to do things differently, because it's exactly what had happened in the Singareni colony thing. Once the garbage was all removed and women were able to breathe and sit in that space, they actually made sure that no further garbage is dumped in that area. They said whether or not there is a dumpster, it would be nice if we had a dumpster here. Let's try and figure out how to solve that problem. But we will not any longer allow any kind of garbage to be dumped here, because it's producing mosquitoes, which is dangerous for us, which is making it impossible for us to sit outside of our homes. And that needs to be solved, right? So I think that questions of garbage are real questions of human suffering in neighborhoods, in communities. And they are also questions of design, they are questions of material technologies. And we often pay very little attention to these material aspects of garbage disposal. We take it for granted that we have exhorted 1 crore people to segregate their waste. But amongst them, maybe about 10,000 people buy biodegradable garbage disposal bags. The rest of them are actually, after segregating, putting garbage in plastic bags and throwing it out after segregation. Yeah, so it's a huge problem, and I think that we need to think about this from that material technologies point of view, and from the point of view of design, as much as we think about it from the point of view of behavior change and in terms of planning. There anything else that I have missed out, Partha?
I want to rely upon people who have been asking the questions to sort of figure out whether they are looking through. But there was Yamini's question that you're still there on the box about the community perspective on risk. That I think is...
Yamini, do you want to come in and ask and remind Anand? You can unmute yourself.
Actually, I think it'll be helpful
Oh,
if she can explain what the question is.
yeah, I was just picking up on your earlier point about how people think about risk and whose knowledge is considered, whose perspectives are considered, how a very people-focused view is not really taken about risk. So I just wanted to, and I think you had mentioned that, that's a subject for a longer conversation, but I was just curious about any quick examples that you might provide of how this has actually happened very effectively. And I put an example there about futures thinking as an approach. So I don't know if that's something that you agree with, or if there are other types of approaches or methodologies where this has happened really well.
Yeah, I mean, to me, risk and vulnerability are the currency for a lot of things that we do, but we don't actually use these words, right? In the exchange in the local communities, the words that people use are very different. They talk about words that are about um, um, that signal something else other than risk and vulnerability. They talk about constraints, they talk about difficulties, they talk about challenges, and often the kinds of things that they tell you are things that they even indicate to you that we don't have the language, we don't have the words. There are experiences that we don't want to talk about, and so on. And they are actually experiences of extreme risk and pain. And in fact, they're experiences that hide a lot of injury that people are facing. For example, one of the spaces that Vanshika is here, she worked on a few years ago, is a community in which there were no toilets, and the one single public toilet that was available was dysfunctional. Very often, community toilets become dysfunctional, and so these are houses in which there are children, there are women, they're living in very close proximity to bodily waste all the time. And there are all kinds of risks that they're dealing with at all times. And yet they don't have the possibility of talking about this in a meaningful way. Um, how do you document it? How do you write about it? How do you take it? What scale are we thinking about? What horizons are we thinking about? These are questions that are very, very contextual. At a larger level, very often many of these things are circumscribed by people's perception of the horizons of existence of that settlement itself. So, for example, the Singareni colony is one whose imagination is circumscribed by the fear that at some point of time they will all be thrown out, even if they are in the government built housing. They feel, for example, that they're left to their own devices in terms of all of this garbage and disease, simply because they're just waiting for the place to die on its own and something new will be built there. That's what they believe, right? And because they know that they are there only temporarily, they can't actually make investments in the place. They can't build anything particularly meaningful. They're biding their time. Some of them have no options. Some of them can imagine what they want to do in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time. Some of them imagine how they're going to encash their claim on the dwelling unit, and walk out of it at some point. All kinds of things happen. To me, the most meaningful way of thinking about it is to remember that people's time horizons are not at the species time horizon level. That is something that we do because we have the luxury of thinking about it in those terms. Very often people sit there and think about what's going to happen to their children, what's going to happen to their young kids as they come out of college, what's going to happen when the husband dies. That's the futures that people are thinking about. And these are very, very real, very painful realities that they are all trying to deal with. And I think that it's important for us to bring them together to think about larger questions. And I'll just give one simple example here, where it is possible for some people in some contexts to think about futures. Very recently, we had a conversation with the taxi drivers, the Uber and Ola type um, app-based drivers union guys. And one of the things they said is that you often think that we don't think about things in the long term or even in the medium term. You think that we are asking for immediate money benefits. But there is something that we are actually concerned about right now. And our concern is the idea that maybe the government of India, maybe Uber and Ola, maybe at the world level, everybody is pushing towards electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, which is a future without drivers, right? But on the way, they will actually replace our conventional fuels. And when that happens, we know that a lot of the vehicles that we are driving now will go into scrappage. And if that is likely to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, then a lot of us are going to suffer grievous injury and really, really suffer financial losses. And we would actually like someone to do some serious research work on figuring out what are the environmental costs of our current vehicles, tell us what is the right thing to do, tell us how to be prepared for this possibility if at all the push comes to push us out of our existing vehicles and scrap our vehicles. So I think the imagination of the future is something that is very real for people. They think in terms of very concrete outcomes. And those concrete outcomes are important for all of us to be respectful towards in our research, in our documentation, and in our designed interventions. That's my immediate take. And if I'm missing anything, I'm quite happy to engage with this further later on.
Thank you very, very much. Thanks a lot.
Okay, two final questions. One, which is, when a city or town is marked as an engine of growth, will not building community assets make it more vulnerable, assuming that presumably these assets make the place itself go up in value, and therefore the area becomes vulnerable. So this sort of, I suppose, in response to your answer to Lorraine. And the other, which I'm not quite sure what the question is, which is what the possibilities of maintaining physical setting of cities with development of infrastructure. So if the attendee is still around, if the person wants to elaborate on that, please raise your hand. We're happy to bring you in. For the moment, let's want to engage with this whole idea about the possibility of eviction and value of land kind of story if it goes forward.
Yeah. So I have to actually, I can't help sharing this anecdote from many years ago when I was spending a lot of time in a municipal office, when I was having this conversation with the municipal official about the legal status of a slum, and about actually budgetary allocations for the slums in the city. This officer basically told me something very simple. He said, look, when there is a constellation of powers that comes together, which wants to evict people, the slum will be evicted. It doesn't matter whether it is legally protected or not. If it is legally protected, they will be bought out and pushed out. Something or the other will happen. They will be pushed out, because this is how money works in big cities, and that is something that we just have to take it for granted. Now, and I have always remembered that as a very important lesson about how things work in the city, that eviction or being persuaded to leave, you can have a spectrum of things that happen, is a process that is ever present. It's never going to go away. Right? You might be persuaded to sell out. You might be persuaded to sell out at a very low price, or you might be allowed to live there for a long time. It doesn't matter. What matters to me, and I think that the thing that we are pushing for, and hopefully we will be able to find some kind of a golden mean, is that right now nobody is interested in evicting these people. Right now, nobody is interested in building anything here. And I have a group of 5-year-old kids who are running around in garbage. And if this place can reasonably be expected to serve as a playground for the next 5 years, you have a generation of very small kids who have had a decent chance at playing in a healthy, safe environment. And I think it matters. I know that I'm in no way saying that I'm not even pretending to be fighting against the injustice of a capitalist city. I'm not. What I'm saying is that be that as it may, at this point of time, there is a possibility of creating opportunities for people. And hopefully, when people's needs are met, they will have the capacity to ask for bigger things. And that's exactly what I was saying a while ago, where this community told me that, look, we never had anything here. Now that we have this platform and this shed on top of our heads, we are saying, hey, how about getting a training program for 15-year-old girls from here who are walking 6 kilometers every day, often barefoot, to make a small amount of meager earnings to support their families. Can we run a program for them here? We couldn't have imagined that program without this place. Now that the place is here, we are asking for it. Maybe we can figure out how to do it. And I think it's just that the nature of the material world is that you create something, it makes other questions, other dreams, other aspirations possible. And that's what we should push for. And who knows what those dreams and aspirations will eventually lead to.
So if there are no other questions, or else I was very nice. So, okay. So thank you. I hope that was useful for you. So Anant, can I take you back to your three questions that you sort of outlined?
Yeah.
And if you can sort of just walk us through a little bit on, let me begin at the end as to how you see the first, okay, one overarching question is in your description of this process, the act of placemaking was always, from what I understood it, an external intervention. And then, the intervention itself can be, you can come in, there can be consultations, inclusion, all of that stuff is but in a sense, it is sort of, it's not intrinsic, but an external sort of intervention that starts that kind of process. Do you have any examples where communities have sort of begun to sort of take ownership and create their own process without this sort of impetus? That's one. But that's, and with respect to the three questions, once this commons is created, in what way is do you see new stakeholders coming in? I mean, Andrew was speaking about the formal and the structures, but in a sense that if you create a park, it's not necessary that only the kids from the slum will use the park, maybe kids from a nearby sort of non-slum housing could also use it, and that might sort of create both positive and negative externalities, whichever way one sort of looks at that kind of structure in place. But if you could talk about, how these nature of stakeholders change as a result of that intervention.
Yeah.
Which is also related to your first thing about returning land to the people so the other way of, I suppose, of rephrasing that stakeholder question is to say, is the people itself, is the definition or the nature of the people itself sort of, does it mutate? When you say returning land to the people, there's a certain group of people who are sort of putting it on from, and when you return it back, does that sense of the people sort of expand? Is there a broader sense of the people or a narrower sense of the people who sort of then sort of begin to put it in place? That's the second board. And the third is this whole issue of auto construction. And I'm trying to get my head around the Turner's auto construction stuff and the way this, so to what extent was the community actually involved in the construction of these spaces? Is the auto part of it, in that sense, I suppose, related to the broader question also asked about external impetus versus internal drivers? So how do you sort of conceptualize that in the context of what the Turner's auto construction story is?
Yeah. Okay, let me start with the first part of your question, which is about communities and ownership of assets and so on. In almost every slum that I have worked in, people have created their own assets, which are shared by the community. What would it be? It would be a mazar, it would be a shrine, it would be an open Chabutra under a tree, people do create these infrastructures all the time. So we are actually not doing anything new in any true sense of saying that we are giving them something brand new that they don't know about. People are building things on their own. What we are doing here is actually something that is slightly different from what people have been doing all along. And this is something that we realized again and again and again in many different contexts. But I'll give you one example. The Singarini colony land that you saw, as soon as the cleanup was done, there was one family which said that let's put an idol here and start some worshipping, some puja stuff. And I remember there was a Muslim mother who went to this family and said, look, we have a mosque here. Our kids go there. You have a temple here. Your kids go there. There's no place for our kids to play together. There's this one place where something like this can happen. Can we hold on to this? Can we not turn this into something that belongs to either this religion or that religion or whatever? And I thought that that was very, very moving. Very moving that this lady said, yeah, sure, why not? It makes sense, right? People do figure out how to do this. I remember another very strange incident in which there was a lot of drinking happening in a particular area. And one woman told me very mischievously that one night what they did was to go and break a few bottles near a place of worship that belonged to their own community, and woke up in the next morning and said that, look, somebody who got drunk broke bottles near our place of worship, and we want this to stop. And that basically ended up stopping with that practice. So people protect their assets, people create assets overnight very often. These are pop-up infrastructures, and they happen all the time. And I think that what is actually very meaningful in the work that we are doing or what we are trying to push for is that we are in conversation with people like that and saying that, is there something that transcends what has been done till now? And I think the answer is yes, because over time, gradually, the lines have been drawn very harshly. The spaces that are available for nondescript folks have shrunk and in many cases just disappeared. And I think what we are doing here is to create those spaces that are available for nondescript um, um, uh, people who can kind of hang out together, invent new identities, tell new stories. And that's what these places are all about. So to that extent, I think what is happening here is quite new. Are the communities themselves, in the Turner's sense, involved in the creation of the infrastructure, in planning the infrastructure? Yes and no. Because the communities that are around have been pushed for a long time into imagining only property and nothing else, even in slums. So essentially what happens is the moment they see an open space, they want to build a community that hall that belongs to one particular caste. They want to build a dispensary. They want to build an Anganwadi. They want to build something that belongs to somebody or the other, and then create boundaries that will exclude other people. And what we have been basically pushing for is that there will be no big walls. There will be, unless the walls are already existing, and we can open up those walls a little bit. But there will be no big wall. There will be no lock and key. These are open spaces which are being brought back into some use. So in that sense, what we are saying is that these are infrastructures, assets that are being created, and we will have some say in how they are created. And I don't feel actually embarrassed to admit that I am pushing for an agenda with the community. I'm not imposing it on them, but I'm arguing with them. I'm telling them that, look, this is how we should do it. We shouldn't do it the way in which you have been imagining it, and we work it out. There are people who are persuaded by what we are saying, and that's how things get created. And I think it's important for us to also at some level overcome this very artificial binary that we have created, that we are outsiders, they are insiders, and therefore we cannot actually say anything meaningful about what they should be doing. We should just stay out. I don't think that's how we work. What we have been basically doing is to say that, look, I think we shouldn't be building walls here. People push and say, let's build walls. People say that this is how we should be doing it. We keep waiting for a chance, because at some point of time we know that if you try to build a wall, it will never get done, because that is exactly what these places are not going to be given for by the government. But if you say that, look, this is a place that I want to turn it into an open classroom, I think the government is not particularly worried about it, and it is equally functional. In fact, it's probably much more functional than a closed walled room. Sometimes they are actually very smart and intelligent. They volunteer information, advice. I remember in the Secunderabad case, then when somebody was suggesting that some kind of a pipeline should be brought from the top to the bottom, and I kind of supported it. There was a construction worker who was working there who laughed very loudly. And I said, "Why are you laughing?" She said, that's a bizarre, stupid idea. It's not going to work because the pressure will not be uniform from top to bottom. And suddenly I realized that woman was, what the woman said was something much more scientific than what I had been thinking through. And I laughed and asked her, "How do you know this? And why didn't you speak up until now?" She said, "How do I know? I live in this very similar place right next door. So I know it. And I'm seeing that you're making a stupid mistake. So I'm telling you right now." So people do participate in that sense because they do have a certain kind of smartness and understanding, and they don't hesitate to tell. We just have to figure out how to learn and how to listen. And overall, I think the Turner's referenced in my mind is basically not so much for auto construction of houses. It's more about the sites and services thing. That's what I'm saying. Create those sites and services. We create those small infrastructures which the state can provide, which requires additional investments that none of these families can actually afford. If they afford, they will build a small temple.
And in that sense, so sort of, how does one create some kind of, do you, in going forward, do you see, you created this competition and brought in a variety of perspectives to think through this issue. Do you see any possibility of the communities themselves sort of being facilitated to think through how a space could actually be used in a
Yeah. Totally. We actually have now requests from 3 places where people are saying that we have places where we want something done. Can we get some help in figuring this out? And that help could be anything from making a case for that place being turned into something else. The help could be from the point of view of designing it, from the point of view of imagining a program for it. All of that. People are asking for help. And I think it's really, really promising from that point of view.
Great. So with that, if there are no further questions, it's been about 2 hours, Anand. So thank you so much for spending this time with us. And hopefully, Rituparna wants to come in. So let me just go ahead, Rituparna. Are you able to speak, or let me just unmute you then? Just hang on. Anant, one other thing that I want to say is if that document that you said you would share, we'll put it in the show notes of the YouTube structure. But if you have a link to it, you could also sort of post it here for the people who are here in space.
We haven't actually posted it online yet. We will do that in the
So whenever you have that, if you send it to that, we'll just add it to the show note going forward. So yes, go ahead, Rituparna, ask a question. You raised your hand, or did you not? You want to type something in the Q&A? Or maybe that was just a mistake. Thank you so much, Len. And the next workshop will be as usual on the last Tuesday of October, which,
Hello, sir.
yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, thank you for the session. I just had a small technical question, and that is, sir, like by when will we get the participation certificate?
We don't issue
Oh, in
participation
the
certificates.
no, in the competition in which they participated.
Oh, okay. Oh, there was
There's-
okay. So go ahead,
They
Anant. You can take that question.
Sir, not that, sir. Sir, today's session, sir, not the
oh, today's
competition.
session.
Yes,
We
sir.
don't
Like, I just
have
wanted to know.
a system of issuing participation certificates with Aparna. But if you
Okay,
need
sir.
it for a particular reason, we'd be happy to sort of send you a letter or something for that sort if
Yes, sir.
you want
Actually, I'll
something
be
of that.
needing. That's why I
So
asked.
just write into Arnaz or us, and then sort of and we can take it from there.
Okay, sir. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'll just post a structure and the email, and you can put that stuff in place. And the next one is going to be, as you can see, on the 29th of October, unless that is a holiday that I'm unaware of. And I'm happy to sort of put that structure in place. Mm, Arnaz, could you just put my email onto the in a place where somebody can see it? Just hang on. Let me just put that out.
Sir,
I can do that.
sir, did you say that I can mail with my query regarding the certificate? Because I don't think I heard you properly.
No, you can mail with a query as to what exactly you want, and we'll try and see what best we can do.
Okay,
Yeah.
sir. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, okay.
All right. So with that, thank you so much, Anand. Thank you so much for everybody who is here. It's been lovely sort of have this conversation and enjoy it. And hopefully we'll see you again for the 176th workshop on the 29th of October. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye.